All right. Looks like we've hit a nice critical mass here at just over 90 attendees. So with that, good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Chris Gillard, a partner with CMG Landscape Architecture, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for the web salon this evening. Over the past couple of years, CMG has been hosting a series of salons on a wide range of relevant topics, ranging from climate action to women in leadership and design. And we're really delighted to continue that tradition in a virtual format and extend the discussion nationally. So it's great to see such a wonderful turnout. Tonight's conversation is about equity and representation in landscape architecture. And it's the first in a three-part series developed by our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity group. We plan to address co-creative and community-driven design in the second session and what makes inclusive space in the third. So let's go ahead and get this started. I'd like to introduce our co-moderators for the evening, Arturo Fuentes Ortiz, who initiated the series, and Winnie Elkindi. Let's give them a virtual hand for bringing us all together.
Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Arturo Fuentes Ortiz, and this first salon, which we titled The Power of Representation, focuses on the experiences of designers of color and landscape architecture. We've invited fellow landscape architects who can speak to the entire pipeline and development of young designers from K-12 schools through university and into the profession. We like to show what firms can do to increase representation by building the pipeline. We would also like to address how firms can successfully engage, retain, and mentor young designers of color. I would like to begin with acknowledging that this was not a top-down salon developed by CMG leadership, but instead had manifested from an idea that I brought to attention last year with the intent to start dialogue about representation and how a firm can reflect a positive trajectory for equity and racial justice. I also feel the need to acknowledge that CMG, and like many other firms in the landscape profession, are predominantly white spaces. But with that said, let's give thanks to CMG for this opportunity and for hosting this conversation. I would like to recognize Winnie Elkindi for co-moderating with me and the rest of the CMG crew. A big thank you to Jamie, Lauren, Pooja, Paulina, Eustacia, and Gina for helping set up the salon. And just to give you a roadmap of today's salon, first we will be giving a small introduction presentation followed by the panel discussion, which then will be followed up by audience Q&A. If you have any questions to the panelists, please add them to the Q&A box at the bottom. If you RSVP'd for the social hour, you should have received a separate Zoom link, and we'll start that meeting once we are done with the panel. And so why are we here? The reason why I wanted the salon to happen was because when I was young, all the media I consumed illustrated the underrepresentation and or misrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. When I was a little brown boy, what I wish I saw was more BIPOC and leadership roles and design roles and architectural roles and more positive roles, period. I know there's a lot of upcoming designers of color and students listening, and I want y'all to know that this is created for you. I intended this to be for you. So today I encourage y'all to connect with other designers of color, because there are already a lot of us doing rad work. And to everybody, I am hoping that this salon can highlight and inspire how to facilitate proactive system changes within your own firms. Because the solution I really want to emphasize is that it is more than just diversifying the profession. It is about continuing the fight to end systemic racism. I want to briefly go over two short projects that led me to the salon. One is called Surviving the White Spatial Imaginary. It is an experiential map project that talked about policing, which then manifested into the workshop called Design Your Hood. Surviving the White Spatial Imaginary is a personal experience map which made a deep impact in my work moving forward. It was the first time that a school project allowed me to talk about race and space. So I generated a map that illustrated all the times I was policed, meaning being pulled over, searched, detained, etc. And there are a total of 15 times, whether I was walking, biking, or in a car. So this map for me was very powerful as a school project because landscape architecture became more personal and more meaningful. And this made me want to help out young Black and brown youth using the knowledge I was gaining in academia and put it into practice. I'm sure we all noticed that a lot of young folks don't know what landscape architecture is, even less in communities of color. So I decided to create a workshop to expose young people to landscape architecture through an existing program called the SET Summit at UC Davis, created by Dr. Vaja Watson. I named the workshop Design Your Hood, where we got youth of color involved in conversations about their experiences in their neighborhood. We asked them to reimagine their hood, specifically their schools, and the result they presented about their experiences and what were some things they needed and wanted in their landscapes, in their school landscapes. We asked them to break out into groups and collectively think of redesigning and reimagining a space in their neighborhood. And then they have the option to draw or just use words, since many didn't have design or art backgrounds. And each team selects a representative to talk about their group's conversation to the rest of the class, and then they present. Some of the major responses: more Black and brown teachers, less security, no school cops, and less regulation on what they're wearing. So most of the responses aren't about design, but about space and how they experience it. What is important about these workshops is that young folks talk about things that they would not normally talk about or learn about in school. And by seeing designers of color, it gives them inspiration and provokes thought that they too can be landscape architects and designers. And getting young people of color interested in design isn't enough. They face challenges when entering college and are less likely to complete their undergraduate degrees. For example, according to the US Department of Education, Hispanic, Latinx folks make up 22% of the population of 18 to 24-year-olds. But then following the Hispanic Latinx bar, you then see a drop to 19% when it comes to undergraduate enrollment. And then once again, when we jump to the distribution of bachelor's degrees awarded, we see a drop off and lower retention rates, particularly in Hispanic and Latinx and Black and African American communities. And once you go into landscape architecture degrees awarded, according to ASLA, if you compare the demographics of the US population by race to that of landscape architecture degrees, we see that proportionately, it does not reflect the US population race percentages. So clearly, we have a lot of work to do in order to successfully engage, retain, and mentor young designers of color. And with that said, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Winnie.
Thank you, Arturo. And I just want to say hello, everybody. I'd like to thank the participants for being part of this conversation, the panelists for sharing their experience and knowledge, and CMG for hosting this salon. My name is Munyi Faida Abdul Majid Al-Kindi. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya. A majority of my life has been spent living in San Francisco. It is here that I have personally experienced the remnants of the decades-old practice of redlining. This racially discriminatory practice has led to the disproportional funding for urban public school students. According to a study done by Education Build, non-white school districts get $23 billion less than white districts, despite serving the same number of students. We ask ourselves, why aren't there more people of color in the practice? I believe it starts with a broken public school system. Subjects that are labeled electives, like art, engineering, and technology, are usually the first to get cut. This in turn leaves students at a disadvantage and therefore left behind. This discussion is important to me because where I come from, I feel like this profession wasn't meant for me. People say, get it how you live, but I could never accept that, knowing that my community has been designed to keep people at a disadvantage. For me to get where I am now, I had to struggle and face oppressions that I shouldn't have to. It's not fair, but as my father says, life is not fair. Why is it my obligation to show people that they are in the wrong when they don't even realize it themselves? My intent is to pay it forward, to make it easier for those who come after me, to let them know that they're not alone, to help build a network of like-minded individuals who can reach out to each other when in need. At this time, I'd like to introduce our four panelists. Davi De La Cruz, Sarah Zodi, Jen Lowe, Roberto Rivera. Could each of you spend a few minutes introducing yourself and telling us about your trajectory into landscape architecture? We can start with you, Davi.
Hey there, thank you everybody. And thank you, Munyi, for the just kind of passing it off. Appreciate everybody for jumping on amidst everything happening around us, nationwide uprisings, left coast fires, hurricanes, and the pandemic that's really impacting us day to day. I really appreciate the team at Winnie, Arturo, and the organizers to kind of put this together and put just a really good conversation together. I'm calling in from the indigenous homelands of the Tongva people, also known as LA. I'm super excited to share some of the work I've been doing with the Urban Studio, and really hope to inspire folks to really figure out a way to bring in youth leadership into different firms and really into different nonprofit organizations, and to really institutionalize a way to really bring in voices that we often marginalize. So my path into landscape architecture, it really started with my high school involvement. I was involved with the local environmental justice organization, really looking at the impacts of industrial pollution on communities and the fact that it's disproportionately impacting low-income folks and folks of color. So this really kind of made me think about what's happening in my neighborhood, really got me interested in asking those questions. So this led me to jump into a program around urban planning. So I studied at Cal State Northridge, jumped into a urban studies, urban planning program with a dual degree in Chicana and Chicano studies. So this kind of shapes my interest in social justice and equity. I finished up with my urban planning degree, and then I really kind of wanted to think through engagement processes, how those are created. And I found a program at the University of Washington that's really asking those questions about how we're bringing in marginalized voices, how we're thinking through the decision-making processes. So I spent 3 years in Seattle, the University of Washington, finished up a program there, and kind of led me into my interest in youth engagement and youth development as kind of shaping my work with the Urban Studio. So really my interest is in understanding how to nurture a pipeline that's really supporting youth of color in the profession of landscape architecture and professions related to the built environment. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, how
Thank you,
about you?
David.
Jen, you there?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you.
It's all good.
Hi, I'm Jen Lowe. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C., but I grew up and was raised in Seattle, Washington. And so currently I'm also a board member of the Urban Studio, and I'm also deputy director, and I lead the placekeeping initiatives at an organization called the 1882 Foundation. And so they are a Chinese American civil rights organization, cultural heritage organization, specifically looking at the experiences of Chinese in America. So actually their placekeeping initiatives are very much new and driven by some of the work I've been doing with them over the past about year and a half now. So my pathway into landscape architecture, so there's some like indirect and non-indirect pathways for myself. In my family, my father was a civil engineer. My sister was in construction management, and I have a sort of an older family. So my siblings are 13 and 11 years older than myself. So those disciplines, one, were kind of like always sort of at the forefront. So my exposure was there growing up. I think my interest stemmed from also how people move through space. So I grew up in the suburbs of Seattle, and the other spaces that we spent most of our time were Seattle's International District, and also the majority of my family lived up in Canada, in Vancouver. So in Richmond, which is a predominantly Chinese population, and in Vancouver. So me sort of observing the distinct differences of how my parents in particular as first-generation immigrants moves through spaces between our like predominantly white suburb in Seattle versus when we would visit family in Chinatown or in the International District and spend time to buy groceries and spend our weekends. So I think in cumulative, sort of those experiences were interesting to me about how space shaped experience and people's feelings. And yeah, how they carry themselves through that space. So now I've been in landscape architecture for about 13 years and took a direct pivot and got my MDes in integrative design, which is a design for social change program at the University of Michigan, where I specifically actually examined for a couple of years issues of access and equity in education. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course, we're glad to have you. How about you, Roberto?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be among these fantastic panelists, and thank you, CMG, for putting this all together. I'm Roberto Rivera. I'm the chair of the Landscape Architecture Environmental Urban Design program at Florida International University in Miami, where I also practice through my studio Roberto Rivera, where we do projects ranging from commercial projects in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in the US, to smaller projects to keep things, I guess, exciting. I am a lifelong printmaker. I do installations, public art as a complement to the professional work. And I'm very involved in research. I guess it's my life project called the Ecological Atlas, which is about visualizing the dynamics of ecosystems and ecosystem diversity in particular. So it's quite apropos. My pathway, I think like many, I've had a circuitous path into landscape architecture. I'm from Puerto Rico originally, and lived in Puerto Rico and moved to South America, to Venezuela in the early 80s. I've actually lived in South America, North America, Europe, Asia, everywhere it seems. And it's not unlike the experience of perhaps many of us, you know, seeking opportunities. My family moved to South America at a time when the economy was booming. We definitely had just some amazing experiences there, me as a teenager. And then the economy went bust. We had to, really were forced to move to avert financial disaster. My dad stayed behind in Venezuela. My mom, my brothers, were 4 brothers, came to the States. We kind of split up and lived with different family in different states, and lived in 4 different states and did 4 high schools in 4 years. So that was an experience in resilience that I think has shaped a lot since then. I then studied with a Navy scholarship. So I became a US Navy officer. I'm a veteran of the US Navy and served in Desert Storm and Desert Shield, and was homeported in Japan in the early 90s. And I served as an engineer, as an engineering officer and operations officer, which was what I studied for my undergrad in engineering. So I think all of these experiences really have shaped this desire and kind of led me eventually into landscape architecture. I'm passionate about language, about culture, about travel and geography. And all of these things, I believe, and in fact, these different perspectives are great vehicles for insight, which I think that landscape architecture being so vast, you know, having that unique perspective has always been something that I value. And I guess I'm interested in shifting this paradigm. Historically, I'll have to say, in my experience, in my years in landscape architecture and before, this paradigm of thinking of your identity as something that you hide from the public and you celebrate in private, I think, and hopefully this is something that's changing and something that we're embracing. And when I was in grad school, I had, I think, a really important experience. I interned with Mario Shedden in Mexico City, a fantastic landscape architect, because I had an inkling that despite all the education that I had in the US, there was something really fascinating about Latin America and about the work that historically has happened there. And Mario was and continues to be a leader. So I think that was really formative and very important. And I'm happy to be in Miami, which is a really amazingly diverse place with great challenges and great disparities, socioeconomic, of all kinds, but really at a place that is representative of so many of the challenges of the 21st century, where I am proud to be and to hopefully be a part of the solutions to those problems.
Cool, thank you, Roberto. Sarah's not able to join us just yet. Hopefully she can jump on throughout this conversation. I know we all have technical difficulties, so hopefully she can join us. For the panel format, we like to follow the arc from K to 12 to university and into the profession. So our questions are organized along those lines. To everyone listening, if you have any questions along the way, please use the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll have some time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. So the first question is for everyone. We like to start by talking about this idea of representation and what it means. Why is representation so important for equity and landscape practice? Could you also discuss the link between representation and retention and why we need both? So we'll go ahead and start off with Avi.
Great. I was about to jump in. So for me, I see representation as kind of a door to inspire folks to kind of pursue something. I think we can't really rely on representation to be part of what is needed to really achieve equity, but I think I want to use the example of my neighborhood. So the leadership and the makeup of my community is pretty unique and pretty mixed. There's Black and brown folks from all over the world. So many cultures. We have Afro-Latinos coming to the community from Belize. We have Southeast Asian folks coming from Cambodia and Vietnam. And so there's just like this richness in my community. And so my work in the urban studio really looks to engage with youth that come from these backgrounds. And so in some sense, I can't really rely on representation. So as a Chicano, there's a little bit of work I have to do to kind of tap into the voices in my neighborhood. In this case, I think the way that I kind of use representation is, you know, I was also born in this neighborhood. I was raised in this neighborhood. And that's kind of one of the ways I try to connect with youth to just kind of make that initial conversation part of what my pitch is for a program. So basically I start the conversation as like, I value you as my neighbor. I value you as like, just like the future that you're taking on as a youth. I was once in your position, and like I go on to kind of recruit them into this 10-week program where we really kind of question why our neighborhood exists, what forces created them, and how we can really kind of work to improve them and really be a voice of change in the neighborhood. And so in a sense, I have to really tap into the real issues that folks from South Central really face, from things like wanting to secure living wages, something really simple, to wanting to feel safe, to just poor air quality. And so for me, I'm not saying landscape architecture can solve these things, but I do think that landscape architecture can find a way to incorporate these concerns from communities to really kind of tackle the issues head on, from bringing community members into the contracts that we're creating, finding a way to employ and hire community members and youth specifically, finding a way to look at the relationship between the built environment and how we create spaces that are safe and promote culturally and neighborly cohesion. I think one other way is just kind of explaining or thinking through how to communicate the benefit of vegetation and trees to treat specific things like particulate matter 2.5, which really impacts neighborhoods that are really close to industrial areas. And so for me, if I'm really able to kind of speak to these issues and kind of come from a place of connecting with folks in some small way, I think it becomes a really valuable way to build a relationship and to build trust. I mean, ultimately, I really think representation can help us create these doors to tap into voices that we really don't often hear or plan or aren't involved in the planning processes traditionally, or aren't involved in governance processes traditionally. So really retaining voices or reaching out to voices that we don't often hear from, specifically young professionals, I think can only really be possible when firms and colleagues, of course, and other professionals really commit to this idea of honesty and transparency about how well they're tackling issues of injustice in like the myriad of ways that they exist in our world. And so I think finding a way to really attack those issues of injustice and then centering the voices of like potential solutions being led by traditionally marginalized folks.
For sure. Thank you, Davi. Roberto or Jen, you want to go next?
Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
I was just thinking about what Davi mentioned about building community. And I think when we talk about representation, it's only good insofar that it can start to create preconditions of building that community and creating places where people feel like they can belong, to be able to open up new conversations. So representation in the terms of like, okay, I need to like, you know, have this mixture of different people of color in the room, but like, why are you doing that? Like, if it's pure tokenization, let's not do that. It is still low-hanging fruit. Like, at a bare minimum, we should be looking at representation and making sure that like finding out who's not at the table or in this room, have to, because we all have blind spots. But yeah, I think it's really important that we're trying to create conditions where people feel comfortable and trusted to be able to get to a point where we're more working towards like inclusion and building trust and finding that people actually have a voice that are being heard in spaces.
Yeah, for me, I think I'm part of the Landscape Architecture Foundation. I'm on the board, and I'm the incoming VP of Leadership for LAF, and we spend a lot of time talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we have conducted surveys. And I think overall, I think 100% of a survey we did a couple of years ago of firms, 100% of the people who participated voiced, they're in favor of increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yet, in terms of practical matters, there was a lot of things that were, I guess, out of step in terms of how people felt heard. If you were white, you felt more comfortable in voicing, your minds, etc. Whereas folks in minority groups did not. That's just one example that came out of that. So, to me, it's the idea of representation, like Jen is saying, it's understanding that equality is not the same thing as equity. That's a really important distinction. And I think that the best analogy that I have heard is that while equality might mean that you get invited to a party, equity means that you get invited to dance, right? So it's a very fundamentally different thing, where you feel respected, you feel valued, you feel welcome. You are more than just a number that's balancing out this quantitative understanding of what diversity is. And so representation in landscape architecture specifically, we obviously wield great power in shaping the experiences of people, the way they identify with place and space. And so we can either give voice to those marginalized voices, or we can abet the complete opposite. We can help developers gentrify, or we can create the environment where people feel comfortable in communicating who they are and what their identity, what they identify with, and what they bring to the table. We have all these tools to persuade, to communicate. I mean, we've all studied and continue to study the best methods for communicating things quantitatively and qualitatively. And so we have a choice there. As a Hispanic growing up, for me, the options were, in so many words, your career paths are, to be a lawyer, to be an engineer, to be a doctor. These are the standard things. To be a landscape architect came later, but it's really about finding that medium where you can leverage all that so that other people feel welcome, so that you can make these changes happen, at that level. So I think that, to me, that's representation. The other thing I'll speak briefly about retention, because that was part of it. I think it's really very, very important to understand that that it's an ongoing effort. It's an effort that is not something that you have the you enter through the door and you're represented and you're done. No, it's this ongoing effort to continue the conversations. There are things that will work to increase equity. There are things that will not, but it's about constant effort and trying and opening up dialogue and recognizing that we don't have all the answers. And so retention is about finding, in academia, as chair of a program, it's one thing to have students come into the program. It's quite another to make them feel like they want to stay there. And that extends, I think, professionally as well. Working in practices that make you feel like you're not the token. You're actually somebody who is contributing great worth to the overall strategies and overall goals of an organization, be it academic or professional.
Thank you. This next question is for Davi. You connect youth with their environment and develop leadership at the Pueblo del Rio community in South Central Los Angeles. When you work with youth, how do you inspire them to reach beyond and broaden their exposure and opportunities? What have you found to be effective?
Davi,
you're muted. That's all good. So for me, this question is super important in terms of social fabrics that exist in a neighborhood, and then like around the youth that I work with, but also around the physical and then the built fabrics that youth kind of live around. So youth come across educators within their schooling that can take part in inspiring them. They also come across older siblings, younger siblings, and just relatives that can kind of help them inspire them and kind of normalize certain behavior. I'm literally just one small part of that social fabric that youth are in. And so the goal for me is to really be able to nurture a learning setting that they can feel comfortable questioning things in their neighborhood, that they can feel comfortable learning and contextualizing their neighborhood, and really kind of help them realize their leadership skills so that they can advocate for a safer, for a healthier future and for a healthier neighborhood for themselves, for their families, and obviously for the future generation. And so for me, I think the skills in landscape architecture and planning are really shaped by just growing up in South Central LA and understanding that for me, living in a neighborhood I'd rather live in a neighborhood that isn't constantly trying to kill me and the people that I live around. We deal with over-policing, we deal with contaminated land, air, and infrastructure that hasn't been invested in for so long. And so understanding and recognizing that not only social fabrics in these neighborhoods exist, but also the physical fabrics and the built fabrics that are around us are what we can use to help kind of create a starting point for learning for high school students and for younger folks. So using place really is I think one of the most effective ways that we can shape leaders that are really aware of how to advocate for basic needs like trees, more green space, more parks, and then connect the issues about green space and kind of beautifying neighborhoods to issues of access to housing and to issues of gentrification and potential displacement. And so when leaders can really think through those things, I think it just makes them much more effective. I've only been doing this for a really short time, and there's been so many people that have come before me kind of enacting these kinds of lessons of really centering the experiences and the lessons that you can get from place and from neighborhoods. Arturo, it was great to hear your presentation and the ways that you really kind of center the experiences of youth and create kind of a safe space for them to really talk through just kind of what they're experiencing in their school, what they're experiencing in their neighborhood. I think that's super important to just nurture effective legislators, to nurture effective politicians, but definitely to nurture urban planners that are really forward thinking and landscape architects that can really tackle really important issues of today.
For sure. I mean, those are really great points. Thank you, Davi. And I think that's a great transition for the next question that we have for Roberto. Roberto, the question that we have is, how have you successfully increased representation at Florida International University? And how has your outreach or program changed to fit the needs of a more diverse student body? You're muted, Robert.
There. It always gets me at some point in a presentation. So obviously, I mean, we still have much more to do and to go. And it's one of these things that, you know, being in Miami obviously has advantages. We are in a very diverse community, and I think our student population reflects that, even though we have to do much more. Specifically with landscape architecture and recruiting. And I mean, maybe some of the things that we have learned to do here translate to, you know, to the professional side as well. But this is my second time as chair. The first round was really a very dicey time because this is in a post-recessionary economy. And I started in the first go around was 2011 to 2015 or so. And so at the time, you know, our incoming class, which is the best barometer for program health in my mind, we were, I think, at 8 students. Where last year we were up to 35. But in the space of the 4 years that I was chair, we went from those very feeble 8 and all kinds of writing on the wall as to the viability of the program to almost 30. And we've maintained that level. We're at the program size now is at 75 and has stayed steady. But it's really thanks to a kind of an all hands on deck approach that, that meant a couple of things. And so I'll go through them quickly. On the one hand, I think that all of us suffer from, at one point in our lives, probably many times, we've had to defend what it is that landscape architecture is, right? And very few people truly understand that. This is kind of like an old saw for people in our field. But for Hispanics in particular, when you're trying to recruit students from Hispanic families, you're starting the race from way behind, because there's another misconception about how landscape architecture is really about menial work and, you know, or you're a gardener of sorts. Nothing wrong with that. But in terms of a program where we're educating students for a master's in landscape architecture, a lot of parents are very much against their kids studying landscape architecture because of that misconception. So we have to spend a lot of understanding that and the message and how we communicate who we are, not just to the students, but to the real audience, which oftentimes means the parents and the families that go through great sacrifice to pay for a college education. So on the one hand, you have to lead with opportunities and communicating really what this is all about. The economics for landscape architects generally tend to be better in terms of hiring salaries than they are for architects. And this is not common knowledge. The fact that our curriculum and our field, at least in Florida, it's recognized as a STEM discipline. This is, I spent great effort in looking at every single course in our curriculum, looking at the CVs of our faculty, looking at our, all of the knowledge-based items that are aligned with STEM. And it turned out that 75% of our courses had STEM content. And so that connection of landscape architecture with STEM means quite a bit to universities that are putting a lot of wherewithal and resources to strategic disciplines like landscape architecture. So that meant really digging in. So understanding the quantitative side of how many courses, you know, what is our preparation, how are we aligned with them, being able to defend that on numbers alone was really, really important. Because it's one thing to communicate to the outside world when you're part of an organization, be it a large firm that has maybe engineering and landscape and all kinds of other disciplines, or a university that has many, many departments. A lot of the effort had to deal with making sure that we had an educated infrastructure of recruiters, of people who were talking about what landscape was. And the best ambassadors for that are our students. So our students, via testimonials, via videos that we created with them, via multiple efforts to educate our university as to what landscape architecture is and was, that was really fundamental. And we have a great network of employers. So, you know, our kids' design intelligence ranked us, I think, 14th last year in terms of student hires. We want to leverage that, and we want to let parents know that. So really it's about understanding what the message is and making sure that you're communicating in stereo through videos, through audio, through testimonials, etc. And then walking the walk. I think, you know, if diversity is important and we want to make it a priority, you have to allocate the resources. You have to be able to defend it on multiple levels. So those were some of the efforts that we underwent, and we have maintained every year through going out to middle schools, even in high schools, doing projects in our community, being a part of planning boards, city planning, all of these things, collaborating on grants with other departments, anything to get our profile out there. That pays its dividends over time because it might not be a direct line to landscape architecture and opportunity, but it creates a network of people who triangulate and understand what it is that we do, so opportunities and resources make their way back to you when you do that. It's a lot of work, of course, but it's really necessary.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, Roberto. And I do want to switch gears here and move on to the next question that we have. And the next question is for Jen. Jen, earlier this year, you wrote an article, Building a Culture of Attribution, which you stated that you participated in or were complicit in white supremacist culture. Could you explain to those that aren't familiar a bit about those terms, and why is a culture of attribution so important to building an equitable design practice?
Yeah, definitely. So there is sort of 12 traits of white supremacy culture. There's a couple, I think maybe academics that put that together, Kenneth Jones and Tima Oken. And this has been around for like 20 years now. And there's like a larger organization, but essentially it examines like the traits of white supremacy culture in the workplace or in an organization. So what I think I found which was visceral, these are sort of all, I think, traits that we all are sort of too familiar with in the design industry and in design practice. So there's individualism, there's power hoarding, there's perfectionism, there's sort of the hustle part about it. There's, I have to go, I don't remember all of them, but so all of these sort of mechanics move through, in particular, like the social and cultural sort of environment of our offices, essentially, right? Like we have quite the grind and we move at such a quick clip that all of these things that we sort of embody and then through our work kind of, I feel like, manifests itself too. So examining all that, and I have to also be explicit, me writing this in the past few months, it would be very different than me writing this like 5 to 6 years ago, probably. My circumstances have changed. I've been in practice for a while. And when I say that I'm complicit in it, I do, one, recognize I don't want to like downplay any sort of like struggles that Asian Americans have in the design environments, but I do know that there's specific ways about my embodying like productivity and trying to, I mean, the construct of race creates sort of social groups and me taking a social identity about what I'm valued in a work environment as opposed to defining what my value is or contribution is in a work environment. So knowing that yeah, so it's the productivity, it's the grind, it's like taking less pay, it's not negotiating your salary. All these things have impacts to myself, but I think much more sort of profoundly, they have trickled down impacts to like people who are really trying to like make space to increase their value in that place, right? So if I'm not negotiating my salary, that makes it just as hard as my colleague to do it, right? or like anyone that subsequently comes like through the ranks in that firm. So we have to really be careful about what is the world that we want to sort of create in these cultures. And so in gist of that article too, talking about those characteristics, all of this have to do with, I was specifically looking at the role of power too, because design has sort of these larger implications about the individual and individual accomplishments. So if we look at our marketing materials, we look through magazines, there's a single firm, there's a single name. When we go to conferences, there's typically a typical rotation of 10 panelists, right? that come in through any year. We have kind of self-perpetuated a very elite circle of power that is able to sort of provide an influence in this profession. And so all of us, I think, individually need to see how our individual networks and decision-making powers can be redistributed to like our colleagues and in our firms and our teams that don't have that access to power. And so if we're already at a compromise because we're a smaller group as landscape architects, maybe the salaries are not great as an emerging professional, like what incentives, what resources, what tools can we sort of redistribute power to people in order for them to be sort of heard, and then also sort of, yeah, make their contributions and impact.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is posed for all the panelists. Y'all have established or sat on the board of firms. When becoming a firm leader, what are your priorities? Were there specific ways that you tried to create a structure and ethos to elevate and retain designers of colors? Was there anything that you wanted to avoid? Let's start with you, Roberto.
Well, things to avoid. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to listen to people's perspectives and to, you know, not be dismissive of them. I think that, you know, at the beginning I said, like, what in my personal experience over time, my education, my service, this idea that my identity was something to be held in private, because you didn't want to stand out, because you didn't want to give a reason to be called out on anything. This is something that's a very thick and impenetrable crust from which we have to emerge. And so when we have firms, we obviously should do everything possible to invite those diverse voices to the table, and also, you know, listen. I mean, I think when I went through my education, the examples that we're looking at, even don't go back too far. Look at our publications in the field. Who do we show using spaces, if we show people at all? When we talk about diversity, do we put diversity and the people in a chapter, you know, who are who are diverse, or do we integrate people as they would be in society? I think when, you know, I think that those are some of the challenges that we have to advocate for, because again, it's one of those things where you might think that you're being equitable when you're really just going through the motions to comply, as opposed to celebrating perspective and diversities of opinion. So it's having people at the table and asking them, giving them an opportunity to communicate and ask them what they would prefer. And that also goes for practice. When we're working in communities, you can take on the role, which when I did my MLA, you know, it's like you're the designer, you kind of have the primacy of the best ideas, at least, or so you thought, and you bring them from on high down to the ground. This is wrong. So it's really about process, about creating a process that checks those attitudes, that asks people earnestly, not because you have the answer and then you want to check the box for community engagement, but because there's value in that, changing the paradigm to understand that there's not just value, but it's an imperative for things to work long term. That's a shift, a philosophical shift that we all have to make. It's not just about bearing it, but it's about embracing it and about challenging ourselves, because the end result will be much better. It's not going to be the one perspective that we have. And that only comes from having a process that invites those conflicting, challenging perspectives constantly.
For sure. We're a little ahead of schedule, so we can take, now we're going to change shifts into taking some questions from the audience. So everyone, if you haven't already, if you have any quick questions, put them in the Q&A box below. The first questions that we have is, the field of landscape architecture seems to continue to be predominantly white. I am curious if there are any firms that are predominantly run by BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous people of color. Anybody want to answer?
The Urban Studio is.
Yeah, everyone here, all the panelists are run by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So we were very intentional on creating a panel that did represent BIPOC. So yeah, everyone here started their own firm. We can send that information later on.
I would also say is to find sort of like the margins to landscape architecture. I mean, we can redefine it. And so if we're looking at traditional landscape architecture practice, that may not be the avenue, but being part of like the Designers Protest Collective, there's so many sort of versions of this practice in the built environment that you have sort of colleagues who may be in sort of related disciplines that want to work with you. So there are people out there. It's just we have to be sort of a little bit more creative in what sort of how we team up and collaborate.
For sure.
If I can add another thing to kind of also challenge ourselves, I think, you know, obviously we have self-selected to be in this conversation, so we might have a tendency to kind of accept or just we're kind of in a selected group, and I think that it's important again to step back and always challenge ourselves. I call it outrunning. You know, from my my identity from Puerto Rico in this country or around the world, like I've been a minority all my life. And that to me has meant just a personal challenge to always do more than is expected because of bias. You know, somebody counted me out. I always want to go beyond that. So I think probably we can all relate to maybe that. So that you're building this resilience. But what it means at the end of the day is that we have to be really, really good at what we do. We can't expect people to give us a place at the table just because of who we are. We have to be really good at what we do, at the craft, at research, at analysis, at being the most convincing communicators, right? We have to communicate qualitatively. For all the talk about quantity and quantitative analysis and data and all these things that we hear more and more and more about, at the end of the day, it's our ability to communicate viscerally and connect with people. And we can be really good at that as landscape architects. So the onus is on us always, individually and collectively, to make sure that we're as good as we can be and then some, because that's really the only way that this paradigm will shift. I think that, you know, at the moment we're living, I think people will be receptive to this conversation, but I don't know how long that's going to last, right? I don't know. We have to make sure that this moment we seize, and that opportunity that we have doesn't relinquish, it doesn't relieve us of the responsibility to be as good a landscape architect as anybody out there, because we're going to be judged you know, from that point of view. So I just want to make sure that we always, we're challenging ourselves constantly to outrun, you know, that's how I like to think about it.
Great. Davi, I wanted to ask you a question. How do we build a robust system to empower youth and those often excluded in design conversations?
Yeah, so for the urban studio, there's two ways that I can think of how we like really approach that question. Like one of the ways is we institutionalized a youth board member position. So as we're making decisions about potential grants and like the way that they're structured and like just how programs are structured, I think getting that voice from a youth and a youth leader is super important. So as a nonprofit, we have like that youth member chair position. And so it's filled right now, and we're super excited working with Jelani. And the other part or that I would say that's super important to integrate as well is just figuring out how to pay youth for their engagement. I think that's like a super simple kind of easy question. Figuring out how to create just stipends to pay youth a little bit more than $15 an hour or whatever the livable rate is in your city, and just making sure that you're including them in the decision-making process for any local project. Oftentimes this can be like very project specific, so it's really important to think long-term how you're engaging youth in not just like one individual project, but really like on a community level or like a master planning level, how you can really bring on the youth voice or even the voices of elderly folks into decision-making processes and making sure to pay them for it.
Cool. We have another question from the audience. There's two questions, actually. There's a follow-up question. The first one says, it feels to me, I work in the Bay Area, that many of us working in firms here are trying to address white supremacy at the same time separately. How can we support each other, reaching across firms in a formal way to commit to making change and address white supremacy within through our own firms? And then the follow-up question is also, do you have advice for initiating and maintaining these conversations in our firm where everybody's coming from a different understanding of race, identity, and equity, looking for specific recommendations on mediators with expertise in the built environment?
I think I don't want to take up too much space, but initially, like I'm just like thinking, invite BIPOC firms or BIPOC studios to do a lunch and learn so that they can kind of start the conversation at the firm, or like figure out a way to invite folks like the urban studio, folks like Roberto into a firm to have these conversations and have them really lead it, and like find a way to compensate folks for their time to lead a conversation like that. I think that's one thing I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I would concur. Actually, Davi, I feel like I've met a lot of people in Los Angeles in particular that are in urban planning or architecture and landscape architecture that do that type of facilitation from firms because they have that explicit experience. So yeah, there's people who want to get paid to talk to you and how to facilitate those conversations.
Okay, I have a question for you, Jen. How do we uplift voices from marginalized communities and advocate to policymakers and developers to recognize the sacred community spaces from being redeveloped to serve only the elite?
Oh, it's a big one.
Yeah, sorry. It's from the audience, you can thank them.
I can speak to like what we do in my work at the 1882 Foundation. So I have a group that is specifically an elderly population, a senior population. So they like are between the ages of 60 and 80, right? Some of them are English speakers, some of them are not. So they already do a lot of things that are working great. So they are natural storytellers. They like coming together and talking about their lives and like their memories. what I've been trying to do with like my landscape architecture background, design background, is to try to make those more visible and tangible in public space. So trying to use like the physical stuff that we do or the visual things to like, you know, create spaces where people can actually see this community of people, like gathering, having conversations. So in my work with Dear Chinatown with the 1882 Foundation, we did a pop-up. We landed right in front of an affordable housing building that has like one half of the remaining 300 Chinese American residents in Chinatown in DC. We had an oral history station, we had a poster making station, we had a little art exhibit. So we, it was an opportunity, just by the spectacle of it, to bring like older people out to have a conversation with some younger people that probably wouldn't occur or happen in like a regular town hall meeting, right? Or like none of these individuals in this space would ever go to like a design workshop. It's just not going to happen with this with this particular like type of segment of the population. So trying to be creative, because I think public history and the work that I do is very complementary to working and unpacking the issues of gentrification. And if we create resistance by telling people's stories and experiences and perspectives about place and challenging, like Chinatown is not just a tourist destination, I think those are sort of like, we can use our powers and tools to drive sort of different conversations.
For sure. Thank you, Jen. I have another question from the audience. This could be to everybody. Have you found specific challenges in starting your own firm, and how do they compare with challenges of working in a firm that's majority white? What about benefits?
Challenges to starting your own firm? No, there's none. It's just all downhill. No, it's very, very tough. I'll tell you. I mean, I've been at it since, I guess in earnest since 2002. You know, you just have to obviously have an overall strategy, but at the beginning you're going to be, I think, by necessity, you need to be involved in many, many different things that you don't necessarily know if all of them will pan out. But I think that's related to another very important principle, which is about giving, you know, give, let people know who you are, what you do, what your expertise is, how you can contribute. Don't expect anything in return, not in your heart, not in your head. You just give, you participate, you collaborate, you know, do projects, some that are paid, but others that won't be. And this little by little, I mean, from my perspective, my experience, I mean, I've always been interested in the installation works. When I was in grad school at RISD, I started a group called Guerilla Gardens, and, you know, I like to think before the term became, you know, en vogue. But it was like this kind of volunteer thing. We would take empty alleyways and turn them into like evergreen forests using Christmas trees that everybody threw out on the 2nd of January in New England. And we filled, you know, spaces with, did these Zen maps with birdseed, all of them for free, all of them. I say there's for-profit organizations, they're nonprofit, and there's negative profit. You're gonna do some negative profit work. You know, but do things that mean something to you. You know, don't do it because you're going to be able to put it on your resume, or because you're going to be whatever, you're expecting some great reward or recognition. Do things as part of your practice that are meaningful, that advance your interests, that advance your curiosities and your conceptual growth. And that in itself builds a portfolio of work that hopefully informs your other professional paid work. At least that's how, you know, so I've participated in many public art I've competitions, I've won a few of them. And then that portfolio grows, but I didn't do things just because in a mercenary transactional way. I did things that meant something to me. So my printmaking, my art, I did prints of my work, and these things all kind of build on each other. So I would say if you're interested in starting your own firm, it'll be challenging. You're going to need, it takes stamina, and it'll be a while before you get into the groove, and people know who you are and trust your judgment and your skills and are willing to pay money for that. But it's a long game. Like anything in landscape architecture, it's a long game. You plant something in the ground, you have to wait for it to really mature. It's nothing different for your career.
Okay, I got another question. Can you talk about any efforts, and this is to everybody, can you talk about any efforts to diversifying and decolonializing the content of landscape architecture academic programs as a means to attract BIPOC? As a recent graduate, my experience going through a very white curriculum was extremely difficult, and I could never fully bring myself to the table. So how can we also bring equity to the content of the profession?
That is a great question. And actually, the plug for Dark Matter University, because if you haven't seen it yet, they are a BIPOC-led group as an outgrowth of the DAP Collective, who are looking to define and create curriculum and content for anti-racist pedagogy in architecture and design, landscape architecture, urban planning. We need a lot more landscape architects to come along. There is a lot of knowledge that exists in these spaces of like anti-racist pedagogy. It exists more in a lot of the like larger design conversations. So in sort of tech, in also more human-centered design research type forums. I think a lot of that has like adjacencies to social sciences, which I think are really important that can be brought in. But yeah, this is a Roberto. I want to know what Roberto says too, because like when I was at the LAF, like I found it hard to even find like non-predominantly like white-led landscape architecture programs in the past few years.
Mm-hmm. Well, something interesting that has happened at FIU since, after the murder of George Floyd, I think, the many schools did this. We in the School of Architecture put together a statement where we defined some action items that we felt were necessary because of the sense of complicity, that we are where we are in large part because of, decisions, whether it be redlining or gentrification, whatever. We've allowed for these things to happen, not because, some master plan of evil, but we haven't been as critical of our actions as we should be, right? And so stemming from that, our students, came to us as faculty, as chairs, also challenging us and saying, what are we doing, right? What more can we do? So we started what we call a Student Advisory Forum for Social Justice that involves students and faculty and administrators, chairs of interior architecture, landscape. And we met and we meet weekly on Fridays at 1. Anybody can come. We started out by talking about the content of history and theory courses. We went on to lectures and exhibits. We went on to studio culture and studio content and what projects do we seek, etc. And in the lectures and exhibits, for example, committee, that was basically a new group, faculty and students, that defined and changed the format of the lecturer. Usually, historically, if you look at our roster, probably not unlike many other rosters, some of the very similar names, but changing that to panel conversations where you bring a community representative, a designer, the idea is that these panels become conversations that are not this top-down designer bestowing gifts upon the uneducated public approach for, that's out the window. And in fact, the lecture series is, I think they're gonna stick with the name, but it's called Decolonizing Architectural Education. So changing the paradigm of what a lecture is, what an exhibit is, because the moment that any university or anybody really gives agency and authority through by putting them on this moment of authority, right? Then you're legitimizing that for good or for bad. So by changing that through the conversations through this forum, we've had a constant back and forths, and the students developed an accountability track sheet. So everything that we say at these meetings is on a Google sheet, and they're checking to make sure that we are making progress on them. So the only reason that came about is because of constant communication and just creating a forum for those conversations to happen. And at the very least, if we can manage that, that's a huge step forward. Otherwise, we're going to be encamped, and it's like, oh, the faculty or the administrators or the students will be lobbing emails and requests to one another without ever really coming to the same table. So that is a kind of like a practical thing and a practical result of that forum in particular. And I have to thank the students for that.
One of the things before we move on,
go ahead.
I wanted to briefly kind of share a little bit about my Chicano studies background and like why I chose it. Aside from like sharing the identity and like wanting to study it, I found a class that like kind of wove in this conversation about urbanity and its relationship to Mexican Americans or Chicanos. And so for me, because I had that like A through G requirement to be able to graduate and get my bachelor's degree, it really helped to like look outside of my department. In this case, it was urban planning, to take a class and kind of learn about how urban planning or urban studies applies to like a different field. And so when I made my way up to the University of Washington to Seattle, I had a conversation with my advisor at the time, and I was trying to figure out how to do the same thing, basically try to take a class outside of the department and make sure that it counts or like somehow relates. I'm not sure if making a requirement would make sense, but figuring out how to partner with American ethnic studies or American Indian studies or any of the kind of cultural studies departments to figure out how to support them to fill their classes, but then also collaborate in terms of curriculum development so that there's like this just interdepartmental collaboration. I think it's something that I really encourage. I took American Indian Studies classes at the University of Washington with a professor, and I was like just excited about the way he approached everything. And like by the time I graduated, I actually noticed that a studio ended up bringing in another professor from the American Indian Studies department. So I was just like really excited that was happening as I was just kind of making sure that I did that for myself. But yeah, just institutionalizing it for students is also going to be super important.
Thank you, David. I think that's a great transition. This might be the last question. It's from a student. I'm a current MLA student, and I'm surprised by how little we talk about what it means to be anti-capitalist designer in the US, given that we know about the way that capitalism and racism and environment and land and climate catastrophe are all intertwined. Can you offer any hope or perspective to young designers who care about racial justice and want to work for the public? Are there any options besides trying to get a job at a private firm that has better practices or starting a private firm of our own?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, especially since I've been in grad school for 2 years. So I feel like it's radicalized me in a way. Because yeah, like I don't know if we won't get to maybe not get to a place where we're not under capitalism, but I'm hoping we get to a place where we put valuation on something different. Like that we do get paid for what it's like, what it is worth to like, to work on issues of social justice and environmental justice. That like working on things that are about human rights is what we put money towards, is what I would like to see this shift. If we still use money as our like primary definition of value right now, how can we transform what we are spending money on and what we're investing in? And I do think that is sort of the major call right now. Like we need to be putting money towards these efforts. Like all systems have been designed like because we put tons of money to like racist planning policies and policies in general, right? Like we have the New Deal, but we don't talk about how racist the New Deal was. So as much energy, as much money we've thrown at being racist, we should also talk about how much money we need to throw at things in order to like counteract those effects. So it's a good call. I mean, me, Davi, Maisie, Kendra, Drew, Jelani are trying to do some experimentation right now and like finding grants and things like that, but it's still like, it's a rough space to be in right now. Like it's a struggle right now for us and we're still trying to figure it out.
Well, thank you. I think we're running out of time. Is there another question, or we can, if anybody wants to give any closing thoughts?
Anybody?
If we're good.
Okay.
All right, so we just like to thank our panelists for the time with us today, and for everyone who logged on for joining us. Thank you. If you RSVP'd for the social hour, we'll be transitioning to that separate meeting now. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, and good night.
Thank
Crystal?
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Later.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.